The lady couldn't contain her laughter as she caught the widow living in an abandoned sewage pipe. However, her mockery turned to pure shock upon discovering the surprising reality of the makeshift home inside. The lady's laughter died in her throat, replaced by stunned silence. The faint light filtering through the pipe's opening revealed an interior that defied all her expectations. It wasn't the filthy, reeking hole she had imagined, but a surprisingly organized, almost cozy space. The curved walls of the pipe, though still concrete, were partially lined with thick plastic sheets and woven straw mats, creating a barrier against dampness and cold. In the center, a makeshift platform made of stacked wooden pallets served as a bed, covered by a faded but clean sheet. Small shelves, cleverly fitted into the pipe's curves, displayed a few rudimentary kitchen utensils, an old book, and a kerosene lamp. The air, to the lady's surprise, wasn't the nauseating smell of sewage, but a faint aroma of damp earth and something herbal, perhaps from a plant the widow kept there. The lady took a hesitant step inside, her eyes wide, scanning every detail. The widow, standing beside the platform, watched her with a stillness that bordered on resignation. There was no triumph in her gaze, only the acceptance of a reality the lady could never comprehend. But what? What is this? The lady's voice came out in a hoarse whisper, almost unrecognizable. How did you do this? The widow gestured with a tired hand. With what I had, madam. Necessity teaches more than any school. She pointed to a dark mark on the lower part of the wall, a few inches from the packed earth floor. The tide rises and falls. One must always stay above it. A shiver ran down the lady's spine. The constant threat of the water, which she had barely noticed from outside, was a palpable reality inside. With every hour, every tide, the widow's life was at stake, suspended by a few inches of planks and her own ingenuity. The lady's initial mockery now seemed like childish cruelty in the face of the magnitude of that woman's struggle. Her eyes continued to scan the space, trying to assimilate the incongruity between the precariousness of the shell and the dignity within. It was then that she noticed, in a more secluded corner, an even more peculiar structure. It was a small well lined with smooth stones and clay, from which a trickle of crystalline water slowly seeped drop by drop into an earthenware pot. The water in the pot was so clear it reflected the dim ambient light like a mirror. The lady approached, mesmerized. This was not the kind of water one would expect to find in a mangrove, much less inside an abandoned sewage pipe. She reached out a hesitant hand and touched the surface. The water was cold, pure, without any trace of salinity or contamination. This is water?" she asked, her voice choked with disbelief. "Clean water? Here?" The widow nodded, an almost imperceptible glint in her eyes. "Yes, madam, a gift. The earth always finds a way to surprise us, even in the most forgotten places. It's an underground spring that surfaces here, protected by the pipe's structure." The lady recoiled a step, the shock deepening in her soul. Pure water, the antithesis of all the suffering, all the filth and hopelessness she had associated with that place. There, in the heart of misery, life sprang forth in its most essential and untouched form. It was a revelation that hit her with the force of a punch, dismantling not only her prejudices about the widow, but also, in some way, her own perception of the world. The laughter had died, and in its place, a heavy silence of admiration and a pang of something she couldn't identify, but which felt very much like shame. The lady recoiled a step, her eyes fixed on the crystalline water, as if trying to decipher an enigma. It wasn't just the water itself, but what it represented, life springing forth where everything should be death and abandonment. The widow, for her part, remained motionless, her expression serene, almost distant, as if she had already expected the lady's reaction. How? The lady finally managed to stammer, her voice still hoarse. A thread of disbelief and something more, something akin to respect, beginning to weave into her tone. How is this possible? Here, in this place. Water so clean. I've never seen anything like it. The widow gave a small smile, an almost imperceptible movement at the corners of her lips, which didn't reach her tired eyes. The earth has its secrets, madam, and necessity forces us to uncover them. I spent weeks digging, testing, smelling the earth, until I found this vein. It is a blessing indeed. She gestured to the earthenware pot, where the water continued to drip slowly. It's what sustains me, and what gives me hope. The lady felt a lump in her throat. Hope. That word, spoken there, inside a sewage pipe, by a woman living at the mercy of the tides, sounded more powerful than any sermon she had ever heard in her comfortable life. She, who had access to filtered, bottled water at will, had never stopped to think about the hope a simple glass of water could represent. Her own home, with its taps that effortlessly gushed potable water, now seemed a monument to her own blindness. She approached the well again, reaching out her hand to feel the water. It was cold, yes, and incredibly pure. There was not the slightest trace of the salty smell of the mangrove, nor the metallic odor of her home's tap water. It was the essence of life, untouched. The contrast with the outside world, the mud, the industrial sewage, the pollution she barely noticed in her daily life, was overwhelming. And the tide? The lady asked, trying to divert the focus from that source of purity that shamed her. You said the water rises. Doesn't that contaminate the spring? The widow pointed to the dark mark on the wall again. The spring is a little lower, protected by the rocks and the pipe's structure. The tide water, when it rises, doesn't reach it directly, but the threat is constant. I always have to be vigilant. If the tide is too high, or if the pipe gives way, everything is lost. The water, the home, everything. The lady looked at the makeshift platform, at the widow's few possessions, and then at the trickle of pure water. That woman's life was a tightrope, stretched over an abyss of uncertainty, and yet she had found an oasis. The mockery that had brought her there now seemed like a cruel and empty joke, uttered by a spoiled child. The lady felt the weight of her previous words, of her thoughts, of her arrogant superiority. She didn't know what to say. The words had fled. The initial shock had given way to a complex mixture of admiration, guilt, and a deep, almost painful introspection. The widow wasn't just a woman in a sewage pipe. She was an architect of survival, a guardian of a secret of nature, a personification of human resilience. And the lady, in her bubble of privilege, had mocked her. The silence inside the pipe was heavy, filled only by the soft drip of water and the distant sound of the mangrove, which seemed to whisper the truth about the fragility of life and the indomitable strength of the spirit. The lady felt a chill, not from the cold of the mangrove, but from the coldness of her own soul, now exposed to the raw light of reality. The air inside the pipe, before just a detail, now seemed laden with the undeniable truth of the widow's life. Every object, every ingenious arrangement, every drop of that pure water was a silent testament to a strength the lady had never imagined existed. She turned slowly to the widow, who watched her with an almost supernatural patience. There was no scorn in the widow's eyes, nor the satisfaction of seeing her oppressor at a disadvantage. There was only a quiet acceptance, as if the lady's shock was an expected event, an inevitable stage in the journey of one who dared to peek behind the veil of misery. I don't understand," the lady murmured, her voice still choked, but now with a tone of vulnerability she rarely allowed. How do you manage to live like this, with the tide, and still find this. She gestured towards the small well, the source of crystalline water that continued to drip its soft, incessant melody. The widow shrugged, a gesture that seemed to carry the weight of years of struggle and resignation. "There's no choice, madam. Life doesn't ask if we want it. It just pushes us. And we learn to swim, or we sink." Her eyes fixed on the water, and for an instant, a glimmer of something deeper, perhaps gratitude or even reverence, passed through them. This water, it's what reminds me that even at rock bottom, there's always a spring, a purity that resists everything. The lady felt a tightening in her chest. Rock bottom. The phrase echoed in her mind, contrasting with the image of her own rock bottom, perhaps a bad day at work, an unexpected bill, an unfulfilled whim. How empty and superficial her own concern seemed compared to the widow's daily struggle for survival. She, who had everything, now felt poorer in spirit than the woman before her. She knelt near the well again, her hand extended not to touch, but to feel the emanation of that purity. The sound of the dripping was a balm, a counterpoint to the cacophony of her own mind, now in turmoil. The lady had always prided herself on her intelligence, her ability to see through people, her astuteness in judgment. But there, in that sewage pipe, her vision had been completely blurred by her own prejudices. She had seen only the shell, the dirty and despicable casing, and mocked it. She never imagined that inside there was a sanctuary of ingenuity and such a precious source of life. I was a fool," the lady confessed, her voice almost a whisper, more to herself than to the widow. Shame burned within her, a cold, relentless flame. "I laughed at you. I judged you. I thought you were just another one." The widow remained silent, letting the lady's words hang in the air. There was no need for a response. The truth was already there, palpable. The lady looked at the tide mark on the wall, then at the platform, at the widow's few possessions. The vulnerability of that home was stark, but the dignity with which it was maintained was even more impactful. With every rising tide, every heavy rain, the widow's life hung by a thread. And yet she had created a refuge, not of despair, but of hope. "This water," the lady began again, her voice imbued with a new reverence. "It's the purest thing I've ever seen, in a place I thought would be the most impure." She stood up slowly, her eyes fixed on the widow, who now seemed more like a sage than a homeless woman. You are an extraordinary woman." The widow merely nodded, a subtle movement of her head, without pride, without false modesty. It was just the acceptance of a truth she had known for a long time. Silence returned to fill the pipe, but this time it was not a silence of embarrassment or mockery, but a silence of respect, of admiration, and, for the lady, of a deep and painful self-discovery. Her world, once so ordered and predictable, had been turned upside down by a woman in a sewage pipe and a spring of pure water. She didn't know what to do with that new reality, but she knew she could no longer ignore it. The lady felt a chill run down her spine, not from the damp air of the mangrove, but from the revelation of her own smallness. She, who had always seen herself as a successful, perceptive, and superior woman, was now on her knees, figuratively, before a woman who lived in a sewage pipe and who had taught her more about life than years of privilege. Shame was a poison spreading through her veins, but mixed with it, there was a strange and incipient sense of clarity. I need to go," the lady finally managed to say, her voice still hoarse but with a new urgency. It wasn't an escape, but a need to breathe, to process everything outside that confined space that now seemed a temple of uncomfortable truths. She took a step towards the pipe's opening, but stopped. She turned again to the widow, who watched her with the same unshakable serenity. "I don't know what to say," the lady confessed, her hands trembling slightly. "There are no excuses for my behavior. I was cruel. I was blind." She paused, searching for the right words, which seemed inadequate for the magnitude of her epiphany. I want to help. Somehow. I don't know how, but I can't just leave and pretend I didn't see this. That I didn't see you." The widow tilted her head, a slight smile appearing on her lips, this time reaching her eyes, which shone with a soft light. "The greatest help, madam, is to see. And you have seen. Many pass by here and see only what they want to see, the dirt, the misery, but you saw the water and the hope." As the widow spoke, a subtle, almost imperceptible sound began to make itself known. It was a distant murmur that the lady, in her bubble of introspection, took a moment to recognize. But the widow, with her heightened sensitivity to the rhythms of the mangrove, perceived it immediately. Her eyes moved to the dark mark on the pipe wall and then to the ground. "The tide is rising again," the widow said, without altering her tone of voice, but with an underlying note of warning. "It's the time of day when it's most treacherous, swift and relentless." She had completely forgotten the constant threat. She looked at the pipe's opening, where the sunlight was beginning to fade, and at the dark water of the approaching mangrove. The sound of the murmur was now clearer, the sound of small waves lapping against the mud. The external reality, brutal and indifferent, was invading the widow's precarious sanctuary. But this is dangerous," exclaimed the lady, panic beginning to set in. "You can't stay here. The water will rise, it will flood everything." She looked at the platform, at the small stove, at the pot of pure water. Everything seemed so fragile. The widow merely nodded. "It's my home, madam, and the tide is my neighbor. I've learned to live with it. I have to raise the platform, protect what I can. It's a dance I perform every day." The lady felt helpless. There she was, a woman with unlimited resources, facing a situation that left her flawed. She couldn't stop the tide. She couldn't protect that home with her physical strength. But the image of the widow, calm and resigned but not defeated, lit a new flame within her. "No," the lady said, her voice firmer now, with a newly discovered determination. "It's not a dance you have to perform alone. I'll be back. I'll think of something, I promise." The widow looked at her, and this time there was a spark of surprise in her eyes. The lady didn't wait for a response. She turned, and with an agility she didn't know she possessed, crawled out of the pipe, feeling the damp mud beneath her hands and knees. The mangrove air hit her, laden with the smell of salt and decay, but now, to her, it was the smell of life, of struggle, and of resilience. She stood up, wiping her hands on her dirty clothes, and looked back at the darkness of the pipe. The widow's figure was there, a serene silhouette, watching her. The lady knew her life had changed forever. The laughter had died, and in its place a silent responsibility and a purpose she had never imagined had been born. She had to return, and not just with words. The lady, now a woman without a name in her own mind, stumbled slightly as she fully stood up, the mud clinging to her hands and knees, a sticky and undeniable reminder of the place she had just left. The smell of the mangrove, once repulsive, now seemed to have a new depth, a mixture of life and decay that spoke of the resilience of everything that existed there. She looked back at the dark mouth of the pipe, where the widow's silhouette remained motionless, watching her with a stillness that the lady now understood as the essence of survival. There was no judgment in the widow's eyes, only a serene acceptance, almost as if she knew that this encounter was a catalyst for something greater. The promise echoed in her mind, louder than any thought. "I'll be back. I'll think of something, I promise." It wasn't just a promise to the widow, but to herself, a promise of redemption, of a new purpose that had just been born. The mocking laughter that had defined her for so long had died there in that pipe, replaced by a heavy silence filled with the image of that source of pure water and the imminent threat of the tide. She began to walk, or rather, to drag herself through the sticky mud, her designer shoes sinking with every step, becoming unrecognizable. The sun was already beginning to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple, but the beauty of the landscape was overshadowed by the urgency that now consumed her. The murmur of the tide was louder, a constant warning that seemed to come from all directions. She could feel the dampness rising from the ground, the mangrove breathing, slowly swallowing the land like a silent, relentless predator. Every step was an effort, not just physical, but mental. Her mind, once so focused on profits, appearances, and status, now revolved around a single problem: how to save the widow, how to get that woman out of that pipe, out of that precarious life, without destroying the dignity she had built there. The lady knew she couldn't simply offer money, not after everything she had seen. The widow was not a beggar. She was an architect of resilience, a guardian of a source of life. Finally, she reached the edge of the mangrove, where the vegetation became less dense and the ground a little firmer. Her breath was ragged, not just from the physical exertion, but from the torrent of emotions that flooded her. She looked back one last time, but the pipe was already almost invisible in the growing twilight. Only the sound of the tide, now more audible, seemed to come from that direction, a constant reminder of the widow's vulnerability. She reached her car, a luxury SUV, which seemed absurdly out of place in that wild environment. The electric doors opened with a soft hiss, a sound that once represented comfort and power, but which now sounded hollow, almost obscene. She got in, feeling the soft leather upholstery beneath her dirty clothes, and a shiver ran down her spine. The contrast was brutal, almost unbearable. She started the engine, and the powerful roar of the car filled the silence, muffling the sound of the tide that still echoed in her mind. As she drove along the bumpy dirt road, away from the mangrove, the lady felt like an astronaut returning from an alien planet. The world she knew, her tall buildings, her expensive restaurants, her important meetings, now seemed an elaborate farce. A stage where everyone played empty roles, ignoring the true essence of life. The image of the widow, serene in the face of adversity, and the purity of that water were like a beacon in her darkness. "I was blind," she whispered to herself, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, blind and cruel. Shame still burned her, but now it was a shame that propelled, not paralyzed. It was a cold flame that forced her to act. She arrived home, an imposing mansion that seemed even larger and emptier than usual. The lights came on automatically, revealing the opulence that once comforted her, but which now suffocated her. She didn't want dinner, she didn't want to talk to anyone. All she wanted was to think, to plan, to find a solution. She sat by the infinity pool, looking at the illuminated city below. The crystalline water of the pool, once a symbol of her success, now seemed artificial, lifeless, compared to the source of pure water that flowed in the sewage pipe. The irony was painful, a constant reminder of her own superficiality. How to help? The question hammered in her head, incessant. It wasn't a matter of charity, but of justice. It wasn't about giving alms, but about restoring dignity, about recognizing the humanity she had so cruelly ignored. She thought of her contacts, her money, her influence. For the first time in her life, these tools didn't seem to be for her own benefit, but for a greater purpose, a purpose that transcended her. She knew the solution wouldn't be simple. The widow didn't want to be saved in a way that stripped her of her autonomy, of her strength. She needed a safe home, yes, but also respect, recognition for her ingenuity and her unshakable strength of spirit. The lady closed her eyes, and the image of the pipe, of the rising tide, of the calm widow filled her mind. She had to act fast. The tide waited for no one, and she The lady could no longer wait to become the person the widow had forced her to see she could be. The chapter of her life of mockery and indifference had ended. The chapter of redemption, of action, was just beginning. She didn't have a concrete plan yet, but the determination was unshakable. She would return, and this time it wouldn't be to spy, but to build. "I'll think of something." She would return. The lady spent the rest of the night in a state of feverish contemplation. Sleep did not come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the dark watermark on the pipe wall, the precarious platform, and the widow's unshakable serenity. The mansion, with its empty and silent rooms, amplified the urgency of her mission. She got up and began to walk around the living room, her steps echoing on the cold marble. Her mind, once so organized for the business world, now struggled to find a structure for this new and complex task. "It's not just a place to live," she murmured into the void. "It's an ecosystem. It's her life." The idea of simply buying a house for the widow seemed too simplistic, almost offensive. The widow had built a sanctuary, not just a shelter, and the source of pure water. That was a miracle, a resource that could change lives. It could not be ignored nor exploited irresponsibly. She sat in front of her laptop, something she rarely did outside of business hours. She opened the browser and typed housing solutions in mangrove areas, sustainable construction in wetlands, freshwater sources in brackish ecosystems. The words seemed strange on her screen, so distant from the financial reports and market analyses that dominated her routine. The early hours of the morning found her still there, her eyes fixed on the screen, absorbing information about amphibious architecture, floating housing projects, and community sanitation initiatives. The complexity of the problem was overwhelming, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a genuine passion, a purpose that went beyond herself. The lady realized that the solution would not come from a single idea, but from a combination of resources and knowledge. She would need engineers, environmental specialists, perhaps even lawyers to deal with land ownership bureaucracy. And above all, she would need the widow. The widow was the expert in that environment, the guardian of the water's secret. Any plan would have to be built with her, not for her. As the sun rose and painted the sky a pale pink, the lady felt a flash of clarity. Money, influence, contacts, all these were tools. But true strength would come from collaboration, respect, and understanding. The mocking laughter had died, but in its place, a new lady was being born, one who was ready to use her power not to mock, but to build. She had a starting point. She had a promise. And now she had a glimpse of a path. The first step would be to return to the mangrove, not with ready-made solutions, but with questions and an open mind. The sun, now high in the sky, poured golden light over the mansion, but the lady did not feel its warmth. The exhaustion of the sleepless night weighed on her shoulders, but it was a different kind of exhaustion. Not the fatigue of a stressful workday, but the weariness of a soul that had been turned inside out. She rose from the chair in front of the laptop, her muscles stiff, but her mind strangely clear. The information she had absorbed about amphibious architecture, floating dwellings, community sanitation formed a complex mosaic in her head. There was no easy answer, but there was a path. The first step, as she had concluded, was to go back. But this time, not as a curious intruder or a distant observer, she needed to go as someone seeking knowledge, offering respect. She went to her closet, a sanctuary of fine fabrics and impeccable designs. She ignored the silk dresses and precisely tailored suits, opting for something more practical, sturdy cargo pants she used for her rare trail hikes, a simple cotton t-shirt, and a pair of hiking boots that had never seen real mud. It felt like a costume, a disguise for the woman she used to be, but as she put on those clothes, she felt a strange sense of authenticity. She was no longer the lady, but just a woman in search of a purpose. Before leaving, she grabbed a small backpack. What to bring? Not money, not gifts, something that would demonstrate her intention. She thought of the water source, perhaps a water quality test kit, something that could validate the purity the widow had discovered. It was a technical gesture, not a charitable one, a recognition of science and ingenuity. She also took a sealed bottle of mineral water, not to drink, but as a visual contrast, perhaps, or to offer in case the widow was skeptical of her intentions. The car, now cleaned of the previous night's mud by one of her staff, seemed even more out of place as she drove it back along the dirt road. The mangrove landscape opened before her, and this time, she didn't just see dirt and desolation. She saw the complexity of life, the stubbornness of roots clinging to the earth, the dance of the tides shaping the environment. The smell, once repulsive, now had nuances, an earthy and salty mixture that spoke of a vibrant ecosystem. She parked the car in the same spot, feeling the familiar sinking of the tires into the softer mud. The tide was low now, revealing more of the twisted roots and dark silt. This gave her a little more time, but the urgency was still palpable. Every hour was precious. She got out of the car, her boots sinking slightly, but offering the necessary traction. The backpack on her back felt light, but it carried the weight of her new intentions. She walked towards the pipe, her steps firmer than the night before, less hesitant. The sun shone directly into the mouth of the pipe, revealing the darkness within. "Widow?" she called, her voice a little hoarse, but softer than it had ever been in a business setting. There was no mockery, just a question, an offer of presence. A tense silence hung in the air, broken only by the distant murmur of the water and the chirping of a few birds. Then, a shadow moved in the darkness. The widow's figure slowly emerged, her eyes fixed on the lady. There was no surprise, just the same observant stillness as before. Her grey hair was tied back, and her simple but clean clothes seemed a natural extension of the environment. "You came back." The widow's voice was a whisper, but laden with a depth the lady now understood. It was not an accusation, nor an invitation, just a statement of fact. The lady took another step, stopping at a respectful distance. "I promised I would," she said, feeling the heat of shame rise to her face, but determination kept her from looking away. I spent the night thinking, researching." She gestured vaguely to the backpack. "I didn't come to judge, nor to offer alms. I came to learn, to understand." The widow's eyes narrowed slightly, a spark of something that could be skepticism or curiosity. "Learn what?" "About this place," the lady replied, her voice gaining a little more confidence. "About how you managed, and about the water. The source of pure water." She pointed to the inside of the pipe. "That is extraordinary. A miracle in this environment." The widow did not respond immediately. Her eyes swept over the lady, from head to toe, as if trying to decipher the new persona presenting itself. The silence stretched, filled only by the sound of the tide, which, though low, was still a constant reminder of the imminent threat. "I know I can't just offer you a house," the lady continued, breaking the silence. "You built a home here, a sanctuary. I saw it, and I want to help preserve that, to make it safe, not to take you away from here, but to strengthen what you have already created." She felt the honesty in her words, a truth she had never articulated before. "I have resources, contacts, but you have the knowledge, the resilience. I need your help to understand how we can work together, not for me, but for you. For your safety, for the safety of this source of life." The widow finally moved her head, a slow and deliberate movement. The lady waited, her heart pounding in her chest. It was a decisive moment. The widow could reject her, drive her away, and she would have to accept it. But the lady felt that something had changed, that the bridge between them, though fragile, had been built. "Come in," the widow said, her voice still low, but with a note that the lady interpreted as an invitation, not an order. "The tide waits for no one." The lady felt immense, almost dizzying relief. It was a small step, but a giant step in her journey of redemption. She bent down, entering the darkness of the pipe again, but this time the darkness did not seem so threatening. It seemed like a threshold to a new beginning. Darkness of the pipe, but this time the darkness did not seem so threatening. The damp, earthy air enveloped her, and the sound of the water, now closer, was a constant reminder of the life and threat that coexisted there. Her eyes quickly adjusted to the dim light, and she saw the interior of the pipe with a clarity that the first visit, obscured by shock and prejudice, had not allowed. The platform, once seen as a sign of desperation, now revealed the ingenuity of a mind that refused to be defeated. Every plank, every lashing, spoke of a struggle for survival, transformed into art. The widow's few possessions, the hanging kitchen utensils, the carefully folded clothes, the small improvised stove, were not signs of poverty, but of meticulous organization, of a life lived with purpose and dignity despite the circumstances. The widow did not move aside, but waited for the lady to enter completely, stopping a few steps from her. The space was cramped, and the proximity forced an intimacy the lady never imagined having with someone from a world so distant from her own. The smell of wet earth and something fresh, almost mineral, hung in the air. "Thank you for letting me in," the lady said, her voice a little firmer now that she was inside. She took the backpack off her back and held it in front of her, opening the zipper. "I brought a few things to help understand." She pulled out the water test kit, a small case with vials and reagent strips. "This is a water quality test kit. To check the purity. I know you said it's pure and I believe you, but it would be proof for the outside world." She held out the kit, but the widow did not take it immediately. Her eyes were fixed on the object, then on the lady. "And this," the lady continued, pulling out the sealed bottle of mineral water, "it's just for comparison, to show the difference." She placed the items on the ground between them, a gesture of offering and respect. The widow finally moved her hand, not to take the kit, but to point to the bottom of the pipe, where the water bubbled softly. "The water speaks for itself." Her voice was calm, without traces of pride or resentment. "I know," the lady replied, feeling a blush. "And I want to understand how. How is this possible here, in this environment?" She gestured to the pipe walls, to the damp ground. "It's a miracle." The widow looked at the spring, then at the lady. "It's not a miracle, it's life. The earth has its secrets, and we learn to listen." She paused, and the sound of the tide slowly rising seemed to intensify. When the tide rises, the salt water pushes, but here, deep down, the earth filters. The mangrove roots, the sand, the clay, everything works together. The lady listened, absorbing every word. It was a simple yet profound explanation, resonating with the research she had done. The resilience of nature, the ability to adapt and create life even in the most adverse conditions. You discovered this alone?" the lady asked, amazed. "Necessity teaches," the widow replied, her eyes meeting the lady's. "And thirst teaches faster than any book." The simplicity and profundity of that sentence struck her forcefully. She had spent her entire life seeking knowledge in books and reports, but the widow had found wisdom in the rawest and most vital experience. I want to help protect this," the lady said, her voice a little choked. "Not just the spring, but you, this place. I know I can't just take you away from here. You built something. But the tide, it's a constant threat. She looked at the dark mark on the pipe wall, now more visible with the light entering through the opening. I researched floating dwellings, structures that resist water. I have resources, contacts, engineers, specialists. We can build something safer, something that preserves what you've created, but gives you peace, gives you security. The widow listened in silence, her eyes scanning the lady's face, searching for the truth behind the words. The lady waited, her heart pounding. It was a request, not an order, an offer of partnership, not charity. "And what do you gain from this?" the widow asked, her voice still low but with a hint of curiosity. The lady hesitated for a moment. I gain the chance to do something right," she replied, the honesty in her words palpable. "I gain the chance to learn, to use what I have for a purpose that truly matters, and perhaps I gain some of your wisdom." A slight, almost imperceptible smile touched the widow's lips. It was a smile that carried no mockery, but a kind of understanding. "Wisdom cannot be bought, madam. It is lived." "I know," the lady said, feeling a pang of hope. "And I am ready to live, if you allow me." The widow turned, walking towards the water source. She knelt, took a small metal cup, and filled it with the bubbling water. She extended the cup to the lady. "Drink, and tell me what you feel." The lady took the cup, feeling the cold metal in her hands. She looked at the crystalline water, then at the widow's eyes. It was a test, an invitation, a beginning. She brought the cup to her lips and drank. The water was fresh, pure, with a soft mineral taste that seemed to cleanse not just her mouth, but her soul. It was the antithesis of everything she expected to find there. It was life. It's the purest water I've ever drunk," the lady whispered, feeling an overwhelming emotion. The widow nodded. "Then you understand. Now let's talk. The tide waits for no one." The lady felt the coolness of the water go down her throat, cleansing not only her thirst, but also a part of her soul she didn't even know was dusty. It was more than water, it was a symbol, a living proof of the resilience and purity she had mocked. Her eyes welled up, and she had to blink a few times to hold back the tears. It's the purest water I've ever drunk," she repeated, her voice choked with emotion. I never imagined." The widow took the cup back, her movement slow and deliberate. "Nature doesn't care what we imagine, madam. It just is." She sat on the platform, indicating with a subtle gesture that the lady should do the same. The space was limited, and sitting placed them on a more equal, closer level. The lady obeyed, feeling the cold wood beneath her legs. The sound of the tide, now more noticeable, seemed like a clock, marking the time they had. "I understand now," she said, looking at the widow, seeking her eyes. "I understand your strength, your wisdom." The widow watched her unhurried. "Wisdom is to survive. It's finding a way when everyone says there isn't one. But surviving isn't living in peace." She looked at the dark mark on the wall, which indicated the maximum tide level. "The tide waits for no one, and every day it seems hungrier." The lady nodded, the urgency of the situation weighing on her. "That's why I came back. I don't want to take you away from here, widow. I want to strengthen this place, make it impregnable. I researched floating dwellings, structures that rise with the water. There are technologies, materials, engineers who can design something that preserves your home, your privacy, but protects you from the tide." "And how would that work?" the widow asked, the curiosity in her voice palpable, but still mixed with an ancient caution. "This pipe. It's my refuge. It's what I know. It wouldn't be a replacement, But an adaptation, the lady explained, taking a tablet from her backpack. She had spent the night awake, researching. Imagine a platform, perhaps with pillars that rise, or a flotation system that lifts the pipe above the highest tide level. We would keep the pipe's structure, but we would elevate it, anchor it securely. We could even create a rainwater harvesting system to complement your spring, or a solar energy system for basic lighting and heating. She showed some images on the tablet, sketches of modern stilt houses, floating structures in swamps. The widow looked at the images, her eyes scanning the details with an intensity the lady hadn't expected. "It's beautiful," the widow murmured, almost to herself. "But is it for me or for your project, for your redemption?" The question hit the lady like a blow. She closed the tablet, putting it aside. "It's for you, widow, and for me. I won't lie. I did terrible things. I mocked you. I saw you as a problem, not as a person. I was wrong, and I need to do something to correct that. Not to make myself feel better, but because it's the right thing to do, because you deserve security, dignity, and this spring. This spring is a treasure that needs to be protected." The lady paused, taking a deep breath. "I have resources, contacts. I can mobilize a team, but I need your permission. Your guidance. You know this place better than anyone. You know what works, what doesn't. It's not my project for you, it's a project with us. To build something you want, something you need." The widow remained silent for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the lady, then on the bubbling water at the bottom of the pipe. The sound of the rising tide seemed louder, more insistent. It was a constant reminder of the urgency. "And if I say no?" the widow asked, her voice still low, but with a firmness that left no doubt. The lady swallowed hard. "Then I will accept, and I will leave. But I will have to live with the knowledge that I didn't try everything I could to help, and the tide will continue to rise." The widow finally averted her gaze from the water and fixed it on the lady. A slight sigh escaped her lips. "It's a big offer, madam, and I am a small woman, but the tide, it waits for no one, and life, it wants to continue." She extended her hand, not for a handshake, but for a gesture of invitation. "Show me more. Tell me about your engineers. Tell me how we do this without destroying what already exists. But know, madam, that my home is here, and my water is my life." The lady felt immense, almost palpable relief. It wasn't an unconditional yes, but it was a start. It was the bridge she so desperately wanted to build. She picked up the tablet again, her fingers trembling slightly. "Yes, widow, let's talk. Let's plan. Together." The sound of the tide continued to rise, but now it seemed less like a threat and more like a challenge to be overcome. And for the first time in a long time, the lady felt she was exactly where she needed to be. The lady felt immense, almost palpable relief, which made her take a deep breath, as if she had held it for hours. It was the bridge she so desperately wanted to build, a crack in the wall of distrust the widow had erected. She picked up the tablet again, her fingers trembling slightly, but now with renewed energy. "Yes, widow, let's talk. Let's plan. Together." She opened the sketches again, this time with a more detailed explanation. "See, widow, this here is a modern stilt house concept. The pillars would be anchored in the mangrove soil, but the house, the pipe, would be suspended above the highest tide level. This means the water would never enter again. We could build a structure of treated wood or corrosion-resistant metal around the pipe, creating a wider space, perhaps even a small deck." The widow tilted her head, her eyes fixed on the screen. "And the pipe? Would it be inside this new thing?" "Exactly," the lady replied, animated. "The pipe would be the heart of your home. We would carefully lift it with cranes so as not to disturb the soil around the spring. The idea is to preserve what you already have, but give it a safe and permanent foundation. We could even insulate the pipe walls, make it more comfortable, cooler in the heat and warmer in the cold. And the water? The widow asked, pointing to the bubbling spring. Would it be affected? No, the lady assured, her voice firm. The spring is the priority. Our engineers would conduct a detailed geological study to ensure that the construction does not affect the flow of pure water. On the contrary, we could even create a protection system for the spring, perhaps a small stone or concrete well that keeps it isolated and accessible, but protected from any external contamination. The widow observed the images, then looked at the dark mark on the wall, which was now dangerously close to the platform level. The salt water was already lapping at the pipe's entrance, and the air inside the shelter was more humid. The urgency was undeniable. And the cost? The widow asked, her voice laden with a lifetime of scarcity. I have nothing. The lady closed the tablet and put it aside. The cost is mine, widow, completely. I have the resources. It's not a loan, it's not a debt, it's a reparation, a way to use what I've been given for something that truly matters. She looked into the widow's eyes. I'm not buying your gratitude nor your wisdom. I'm investing in your safety and in the protection of something that is more valuable than any fortune. A heavy silence filled the pipe, broken only by the sound of the rising tide and the constant bubbling of the spring. The widow pondered, her expression unreadable. She had spent years distrusting everything and everyone, and the lady's offer seemed almost too good to be true. But the tide did not lie. And the men? The widow asked, her voice low. Engineers, workers, will they come here? Will they step on my land? Will they make noise? They will come, the lady replied, honest, but they will be few, and they will be instructed to respect this place and your privacy. I will be here, supervising every step. You will have the final say on everything. Nothing will be done without your approval, and the goal is to minimize the impact, to build with respect for the mangrove, using techniques that do not harm the ecosystem. The widow sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of years of struggle. She looked at the spring, then at the lady. I don't know what to say, madam. I never imagined anyone would offer me something like this. You don't have to say anything now, the lady said, extending her hand, not to touch but in a gesture of openness. Just allow me to begin. Allow me to bring an engineer to make an initial assessment, to see how we can do this in the best possible way, without disturbing the spring, without destroying what you have built, so that you can live in peace without the constant fear of the tide. The widow hesitated for a long moment, her eyes scanning the lady's face, searching for any sign of falsehood. But what she found was only raw sincerity, a determination that seemed genuine. The lady, who once mocked, now seemed an unlikely ally. All right, the widow finally said, her voice almost a whisper, but with one condition. Any condition, widow? You will teach me, the widow said, her eyes fixed on the lady's. About these plans, about how they build, I want to understand. I want to know how to protect my home, even after you leave. A genuine warm smile spread across the lady's face. It was a smile of relief, of hope, of a new and unexpected partnership. I will teach you everything I can, widow, and I'm sure you will have much to teach me too. The tide continued to rise, the salt water now lapping at the wooden platform. But inside the pipe, a new current of hope began to flow, as pure and strong as the spring water. The lady's smile was a beacon in the dimness of the pipe, reflecting the pure water bubbling below. The words hung in the humid air, a whispered promise against the insistent lapping of the rising tide. The widow merely nodded, her gaze still intense, but now tinged with a spark of something new. Perhaps hope, Perhaps just cautious curiosity. The salt water already covered the edge of the wooden platform, and the sound of small waves hitting the pipe's entrance was unmistakable. There was no time to lose. The lady, with renewed energy, took out the tablet again. I need to make some calls to the engineer, to the logistics team. They'll need time to prepare, to understand the complexity of the site. She looked at the widow, seeking approval. Can I use my phone here? Will it disturb you? The widow nodded, indicating yes. Do what needs to be done, but remember, no unnecessary noise, and don't disturb my neighbors. She gestured vaguely towards the mangrove, where the crabs were already beginning to hide as the tide rose. The lady nodded, understanding. She moved away a little, to give the widow some space, and began to dial. Her voice, once full of mockery and then guilt, now carried a focused authority, but tempered with a new respect. She explained the situation clearly, the urgency, the need for a sensitive and discreet approach. Yes, it's a mangrove. Yes, it's an existing structure. No, we can't just demolish. We need to elevate, protect, integrate. She spoke in terms of innovative engineering solution and sustainability project, but the widow knew that deep down it was about her safety. As the lady spoke, the widow watched. She saw the determination in the woman's eyes, the way her fingers typed quickly, the seriousness in her voice. It was a different lady from the one she knew, the one who ridiculed her from afar. This lady seemed committed. A few hours passed, filled with the lady's calls and the widow's vigilant silence. The tide reached its peak, the salt water invading a little more of the pipe's interior, but without reaching the spring. The widow had to move to a higher point, observing the lady with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. Finally, the lady ended the last call, exhaling a long sigh. All right, the chief engineer, Dr. Elias, will come tomorrow morning. He specializes in structures in aquatic environments and has a great environmental sensitivity. He will come alone for the initial assessment, and I will be with him the whole time. She looked at the widow. He knows your condition. He knows you are the priority and that your approval is fundamental. The widow nodded slowly. Tomorrow? Early? Yes. As soon as the sun rises, to take advantage of the low tide, it will be easier for him to access and take initial measurements. The lady paused. I brought some provisions in my backpack, drinking water, some non-perishable food, if you need anything. The widow shook her head. I have what I need, but thank you. It was the first time she had accepted something from the lady without resistance, without a hint of distrust. It was a small step, but significant. Night fell over the mangrove, bringing with it the nocturnal sounds of wildlife and the damp smell of the tide. The lady, exhausted but invigorated, sat in a corner of the pipe, watching the widow prepare for sleep. The widow, in turn, watched the lady, the unexpected presence of the rich woman in her precarious sanctuary. The silence between them was no longer one of hostility, but of a strange coexistence, common ground that was being carefully built. The lady knew the path would be long, full of challenges and distrust to be overcome, but looking at the pure water bubbling at the bottom of the pipe, and at the widow's silhouette, she felt a peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. The tide would rise and fall, but now, perhaps, the widow would no longer be alone to face it. And the lady, for the first time, felt she was truly doing the right thing. The first light of dawn peeked through the pipe's openings, painting the interior with soft shades of grey and pink. The salty smell of the mangrove was stronger now, mixed with the earthy aroma of vegetation and the mineral freshness of the spring. The lady woke with a slight start, her body stiff and sore from the restless night on the uneven ground. She blinked, her eyes adjusting to the dim light, and saw the widow already sitting, watching the pipe's entrance with a stillness that seemed part of the landscape. The tide had receded significantly, revealing the tangled roots of the mangroves and the dark, rich mud of the swamp. Small crabs were already venturing out of their hiding places, dotting the landscape with their quick movements. "Good morning," the lady murmured, her voice hoarse. The widow merely nodded. Without averting her gaze from the entrance, there was a palpable expectation in the air, a mixture of apprehension and an almost childlike curiosity. It wasn't long. A small motorboat, almost silent, glided through the calm water of the creek that snaked through the mangrove. In it, a middle-aged man with neatly trimmed grey hair and thin-rimmed glasses navigated with precision. He wore practical but clean field clothes and carried a backpack and a toolbox. The lady stood up, straightening her crumpled clothes. "That's him," she whispered to the widow. "Dr. Elias." The boat stopped at a respectful distance from the pipe's entrance. Dr. Elias turned off the engine, and silence returned, broken only by the birdsong and the bubbling of the spring. He waved to the lady, a contained smile on his face. "Good morning, madam," he said, his voice calm and professional. "I'm on time." "Perfect, Dr. Elias," the lady replied, approaching the entrance. "This is the widow." Dr. Elias turned to the widow, who remained seated, observing him with penetrating intensity. He did not try to get too close, nor invade her space. Instead, he gave a slight nod, a gesture of respect. "It's an honor to meet you, widow. I've heard much about your ingenuity." The widow did not respond immediately, her eyes assessing the man. Finally, she gave a small nod in return, a tacit permission for him to proceed. Dr. Elias disembarked carefully, stepping onto the firm mud of the low tide. He put on rubber boots and began to set up a tripod with laser measuring equipment. The lady explained in a low voice, "He's going to do an initial topographic survey to understand the terrain and elevations." As the engineer worked, moving with silent efficiency, the lady approached the widow. "He's very careful. He understands the importance of not disturbing the environment." Sudrine, the widow watched Dr. Elias's every move. When he approached the pipe, he stopped, studying the structure carefully. He took out a small notebook and a pen, making notes. "The pipe structure is remarkably stable considering the conditions," Dr. Elias commented, more to himself than to them. He knelt, examining the base of the pipe and the surrounding soil. The natural compaction of the mangrove, combined with the cylindrical shape, has given it unexpected strength. He then turned to the spring, his eyes shining with interest. "And this is the famous spring. Incredible." He took a small, sterile vial from his briefcase. "With your permission, widow, I would like to collect a small sample for analysis to ensure the water quality is maintained during and after construction." The widow hesitated for a moment, but the lady intervened. "It's for your safety, widow, to ensure the water remains pure." The widow nodded, and Dr. Elias, with precise and careful movements, collected the sample. He then began to take detailed measurements of the pipe's interior, the height of the platform, the high tide mark on the wall. "Elevation will be the main challenge," he explained, looking at the lady and then at the widow. "We need a robust foundation that doesn't affect the water table or the stability of the mangrove. Deep pillars, probably concrete, anchored in rock or firmer soil beneath the mud. And the support structure for the pipe will have to be designed to distribute the weight evenly." The widow, who until then had only observed, finally spoke. "And the noise, and the dirt, my neighbors, they don't like disturbance." She pointed to the mangrove, to the birds flying over the trees. Dr. Elias nodded, understanding. "I understand perfectly, widow. Our goal is to minimize the impact. We will use quieter equipment whenever possible, Most of the prefabrication will be done off-site, and the parts will be transported and assembled here with minimal interruption. And of course, all waste and debris will be removed immediately. The lady instructed me on the importance of respecting this ecosystem. The lady confirmed with a nod. Every detail will be planned to be as non-invasive as possible, and you, widow, will be involved in every decision. Dr. Elias spent the entire morning working, taking measurements, taking photos, and drawing preliminary sketches in his notebook. He explained each step to the lady, who in turn translated and simplified for the widow, ensuring she understood. The widow, true to her nature, asked pointed questions, demonstrating sharp intelligence and genuine concern for details. At noon, the tide began to rise again, and Dr. Elias packed up his equipment. "I have enough data for the initial phase of the project," he said, closing his briefcase. "I now need to go to the lab to analyze the water sample and begin structural modeling. I will return with a more detailed plan in a few days." He turned to the widow. "It was a pleasure, widow. Your home is a testament to resilience and the spring. It's a treasure." The widow, for the first time, allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Thank you, Doctor." As Dr. Elias returned to his boat and departed as silently as he arrived, the lady felt immense relief. The first step had been taken. She looked at the widow, who now observed the mangrove with a thoughtful expression. "He's good, isn't he?" the lady asked. "He understands. He sees what's important." The midday sun beat down, but inside the pipe, the pure water continued to bubble, a constant reminder of the promise that was beginning to materialize. The lady knew the path would be long, but the seed of trust had been planted. The days that followed the acceptance of the plan were a whirlwind of activity, but surprisingly silent and respectful activity. Dr. Elias, true to his word, mobilized a team that seemed to move with the delicacy of crabs in the mangrove. Small boats transported prefabricated materials, and low-impact cranes, mounted on floating barges, worked with almost surgical precision. The lady was always present, a vigilant shadow, observing every movement. She not only supervised, but continued to be the bridge between Dr. Elias's technical world and the widow's reality. "They are preparing the base for the pillars," she explained, pointing to the stakes that were carefully inserted into the muddy soil without disturbing the surface. "It's like the roots of a tree, but made of concrete to hold your house very firm." The widow, in turn, watched with a mixture of fascination and apprehension. She saw her home, her refuge, slowly being surrounded by strangers and machines. But the lady's promise and the respectful conduct of Dr. Elias's team began to erode her distrust. She noticed how the workers avoided bird nests, how they collected every piece of trash, how Dr. Elias himself came daily to check the flow of the spring, ensuring nothing affected it. The most dramatic moment came with the elevation of the pipe. It was a low-tide day, the sun high in the sky. With robust cables and a crane operating with calculated slowness, the pipe that had been the widow's home for so many years began to rise from the mangrove. The widow stood beside the lady, her eyes fixed on her house, which now floated in the air. It was a surreal, almost magical sight. The sound of the mangrove seemed to hold its breath. "Don't worry, widow," the lady whispered, feeling the tension in the woman's body. "It's just going up to a safer place." Slowly, millimeter by millimeter, the pipe was positioned onto the precast concrete platform, which now rose above the high tide line. The platform, with its openings and organic design, seemed a natural extension of the mangrove, not an intrusion. When the pipe finally settled with a soft thud, a collective sigh escaped the workers. The widow, for the first time, smiled openly. Not a small, contained smile, but a smile that lit up her face, marked by time and struggle. "My home," she murmured, her voice choked. "It's High up. The lady felt a wave of emotion that hit her with the force of a tide. It wasn't just the widow's house that was being elevated, but the dignity and hope of a life. In the following weeks, Phase 2 was implemented. An elevated, discreet walkway made of recycled wood connected the pipe to firm ground, offering safe and dry access. Solar panels were installed on top of the pipe, providing energy for soft lighting and a small fan if the widow desired. And, crucially, the spring was protected by an internal glass and wood structure, keeping it accessible and visible, a crystalline heart beating in the center of the home. Phase 3 brought the customizations. The widow, now more at ease, requested a small, recycled glass window at the end of the pipe, facing the sunset over the mangrove. She also accepted discreet thermal insulation, which would make the nights milder and the days cooler. 3 months later, the project was complete. Dr. Elias's small boat made its last visit, bringing with it the final documents and an air of satisfaction. "It's a success, widow," he said, looking at the elevated pipe now integrated into the landscape. "Your home is safe, and the spring is a miracle that will continue to flow." The widow, sitting on her elevated platform, looked out of the new window. The mangrove stretched before her, the tide rising and falling, but never again threatening her home. The pure spring water bubbled softly, the promise fulfilled. "I never imagined," the widow began, her voice soft, "that one day I would have this." She gestured to the space around her, to the security, to the beauty. "I was so used to fighting." The lady sat beside her, her gaze also lost in the horizon. "Sometimes, widow," she said, her voice laden with a humility she never thought she would possess, "the struggle teaches us the value of what truly matters, and it shows us that the greatest wealth is not what one accumulates, but what one shares. You taught me that." The widow turned to the lady, her eyes meeting hers. There was no more bitterness, only a deep understanding. "And you taught me that not every mocking madam is incapable of seeing the truth." They laughed, a light, liberating sound that echoed inside the pipe, mingling with the eternal bubbling of the spring. The late afternoon sun painted the sky orange and purple, and the mangrove seemed to breathe in peace. The lady knew that her journey of redemption was just beginning. But there, in that elevated pipe, beside the widow and the source of pure water, she had found a new purpose. The house in the mangrove was no longer a symbol of despair, but a beacon of resilience, hope, and the unexpected connection between two souls. The water continued to bubble, a constant reminder that even in the most improbable places, purity and life always find a way.